This happened a long time ago on Halloween. I was about 11 or 12 years old back then. Every year, I would go trick-or-treating with my best friend Josh and his family. My parents would stay home and hand out candy at our house, and I would go trick-or-treating in the neighborhood. Josh and I were still young enough that we needed to have an adult around when we went out, but we were starting to enter that rebellious stage. Therefore, we were constantly trying to get away from Josh's mom, who was our chaperone for the evening. She was also busy with Josh's little sister, so it was not long before the two of us were pretty much on our own. Josh and I continued ringing doorbells for an hour or so when another kid approached us. He said his name was Tim and asked if he could join us. Tim was a few inches taller than Josh and I, and we guessed he was probably a few years older as well. That would explain why he was not with a parent. He was dressed as a werewolf with a pretty elaborate costume. His mask covered his entire head with what looked like real fur, although it was probably fake. Josh quickly agreed to let him join us. We didn't recognize him from school, but having a friend in a higher grade would look good on us. By this time, Josh's mom was at least 6 or 7 houses behind us, so the three of us were pretty much on our own. We continued to knock on doors and gather candy for a while longer. Tim seemed pretty cool. He shared some of the same interests that we had. Video games, music, and the typical stuff. After a while, Tim stopped us and said, "Guys, there's another neighborhood where the houses are closer together. If we head over there, then we could cover more ground and get way more candy." "I'm in. How do we get there?" Josh asked. "We can take my dad's car. He lets me use it," Tim assured us. Like I said, I knew Tim was a few years older, but I didn't think he was old enough to drive. I was starting to feel uneasy, but when I looked over at Josh, his face was lit up. I think he was excited by the idea of going off with his cool new friend. I wanted to say no, but I was worried that I would seem like a downer, so I agreed. You know how peer pressure works. We followed Tim to his car. It was a newer model Toyota hatchback with tinted windows and a silverish paint job. It was parked on the street only a few blocks away. As we approached the car from behind, Tim unlocked the door with his remote. He got into the driver's seat and took off his mask. Josh walked around to the front seat while I opened the passenger door behind the driver. When I leaned down to get into the car, I locked eyes with Tim and almost fainted from fear. Tim must have been at least 45 years old. He was dressed up for Halloween and pretended to be a teenager. I turned around and sprinted away from the car. I didn't even try to warn Josh. I'm not proud of that last part, but it really was a fight or flight situation, and I did what I did. Luckily, after a few minutes, Josh and I found each other. It turned out that he saw me take off and realized something was wrong. Although it could have turned out worse, this was one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me. Halloween is all about being scared, but this was another level. We were too embarrassed to tell anybody what happened, so we kept the incident to ourselves. Looking back, I know we should have told someone, but we didn't. I can never be sure what that guy had planned, but I wanted no part of it. This happened to me last Halloween. I'm a single guy, and I live by myself in a small apartment complex. There are rows of townhouse-style buildings that are only 2 stories high. I live on the ground floor of one of them. It was a newer place, and all the doors were electronic. You could get into your apartment with an app on your phone if you forgot your keys. I always found that kind of thing unnecessary, but it was there if I needed it. There were some young families among my neighbors, so I usually get a few trick-or-treaters, probably only 5 or 10 for the whole night. We hardly ever get outsiders come in for Halloween. It's not a gated community or anything, but I figure maybe it looks like private property from the outside, so the kids from the surrounding neighborhood usually avoid it. I always make sure to have a box of Halloween candy for the kids that live there, though. It started off like any other Halloween. I stayed home as usual to give out candy. Trick-or-treaters started coming to my door at around 6:30 p.m. like usual, and after probably half an hour, I had seen pretty much every kid that I recognized. Thinking that it was all over, I sat down on my couch and turned on the TV. Then I ate a few of the leftover peanut butter cups from my candy bowl. I always made sure to get candy that I actually like, since there were always leftovers. By around 8 p.m., I was almost certain that there would be no more people coming, so I walked to my front door and turned off the light. As I turned away, I heard a knock at the door. When I turned around, I could see through the small window on my door that a man was standing there. I figured that he probably had a kid with him, but since the window was at eye level for an adult, I wouldn't be able to tell. "Just a minute," I said. Then I walked to my living room to grab the candy bowl. I returned to the front door with what was left of the candy and opened it ready to dump the rest into the lucky child's bag. However, when I opened the door, I was surprised to find that the man was alone. He was about my height and he wore a gray hoodie with black track pants. His face was cleanly shaven and he was about 40 years old if I had to guess. "Hey man, sorry to bother you. I was just having some trouble with my car. Can I use your phone?" he asked. I was obviously uncomfortable with this request. We keep our lives on our phones these days, so I don't think too many people would just hand over their phone to a complete stranger. "Sorry, I don't think so. Is there someone I can call for you?" I offered. "Come on, buddy. It'll just take a second, if you let me do it," he pleaded. We went back and forth for a little while. I could tell that his frustration was building, which was further confirming my stance. Eventually, I said, "It's not going to happen. Just forget about it." His face turned red. I was actually afraid he was going to attack me, but he didn't. The man simply turned around and walked away. I closed the front door and made sure to lock it. Then I peered through the window and watched him as he walked away. The whole interaction left me shaken and confused, so when he was a safe distance away, I quietly opened my door and slipped out onto the street. I wanted to see where he was going. For a few blocks I followed the guy, keeping a distance of at least 30 or 40 feet. Eventually, he made his way to the parking lot of a grocery store around the corner from my place. I watched as he got into his car and drove away. I can only speculate on exactly what he wanted with my phone, but as I mentioned before, my doors can be controlled through an app. I think he may have known that somehow, and was trying to install some kind of virus on my phone so that he could rob me later. An overly elaborate plan to rob a single apartment, but that's my guess. Either way, he was a liar and definitely up to something. When I was 13 years old, I went trick-or-treating with my friends. I was at that age where it was still acceptable to go trick-or-treating, but I was old enough that I could go without any parental supervision. A good combination. Our neighborhood was in a pretty typical suburban area. Although I had lived there for my entire life, there were still a few neighbors who I hardly knew. Some people kept to themselves, and that's fine. However, some have different reasons for staying away from others, and that's what this story is all about. It was around 6:30 p.m., and my friends Chris, Aaron, and Kevin were getting ready at my house. Chris dressed up as Harry Potter, Aaron went as Bigfoot, and Kevin just draped a sheet over his body and said he was a ghost. He always had the worst costumes. I was going out as the Incredible Hulk, even though I was super skinny at the time. My parents were out at a Halloween party that night, and they were not going to be back until late. The four of us headed out and started trick-or-treating around the neighborhood. We were making great time, and it was not long before we had covered the entirety of the area. Our bags were already pretty full, but it was still early, so we decided to keep going. There was another area that we knew only about a 10-minute walk away, so the four of us headed over there and continued knocking on doors. The houses around there were a little older, and the people were older as well. I didn't know anyone at my school who actually lived there. Nonetheless, the houses were all decorated for Halloween, so we figured it would be worth it. After about half an hour, our bags were way too full to continue. It was also starting to get late, so we all split up and headed home with a great haul of candy. I opened the front door to my house and stepped inside. It was clear that my parents were still at the party because the driveway was empty. I went to the living room and sat on the couch, then turned on the TV and started eating some of my Halloween candy. About 10 minutes later, I started feeling tired and a little sick. I laid my head down on one of the decorative pillows that my mom keeps on the couch. After that, I only remember flashes of what happened. I was feeling incredibly woozy, almost like I was half asleep. But I distinctly remember seeing a tall man walk past me on the couch. He was way too tall to be my father, and my mother was not there at all. He leaned over to me on the couch and placed a hand on my head. That's all I remember before I came to. I got up and walked to the front of the house. I looked out the window, and my father's car was still missing. My parents weren't even home yet. I checked the rest of the house, but it was completely empty. You may think that I was hallucinating or dreaming, but I don't think that can be true. I wasn't that tired. It was only about 9:30 p.m. at the time. It's hard to think of a reasonable explanation for what happened, though. I thought about it for several minutes, then I threw away the rest of my candy. I called my 3 friends and told them to do the same. This is something that happened when I was 14 years old. Halloween was coming up, and I had recently learned that I was too old to go trick-or-treating. Although disappointed, I was excited to be growing up, and in a way, I was happy to leave the tradition behind. It was fun while it lasted, though. Even though we couldn't go trick-or-treating, my friends and I wanted to do something for Halloween. It had always been my favorite holiday, and it seemed like a shame not to go out and do something. I talked to my 2 best friends, Phil and Connor, to come up with some ideas. Phil was actually a year younger, and still wanted to go trick-or-treating, but Connor and I talked him out of it. We sat down together at lunch, and tried to think of something to do. Connor had been watching some of those ghost hunting shows on TV, and suggested that we go to the old cemetery and try to find a ghost. I never believed in that kind of stuff, and I'm pretty sure my friends didn't either, but we decided to give it a try anyway. Nobody came up with a better idea. We met at my house at around 6 p.m., then started walking down the street to the cemetery. The neighborhood was filled with kids dressed up for the occasion. I lived in a good suburban place. Almost every house around there had at least a few kids, so Halloween was huge. The bright streetlights shone down on the crowds of children with their parents. It brought back good memories from prior Halloweens. It was only about a 20-minute walk to the cemetery, and on the way, we cracked some jokes and reminisced about the past. None of us bothered to dress up. I never cared for the whole costume part of Halloween. To me, it was just something you had to do in order to get free candy. There was a huge wrought iron gate at the front of the cemetery. It was locked, so we walked around and found a spot where the fence was not as high. Then we climbed it, and we were in. The 3 of us looked at each other. There was a mutual feeling of excitement between us, probably more because we were trespassing than anything else. I don't think any of us took the whole ghost thing very seriously. We started walking past the old weathered tombstones. The cemetery was no longer active, meaning that no new graves were being dug. There was just a small crew that would come by once a week to cut the grass and stuff. So all the graves were pretty old. It was a very eerie place to be after dark. We continued walking and talking for several minutes when we started to hear a strange noise, like a constant hum off in the distance. My friends and I looked at each other. "Looks like we found our first ghost," I said sarcastically. Phil and Connor burst out laughing. We didn't think it was anything, but we decided to follow it anyway. As we got closer, the hum became more audible, and it started to sound like people chanting. There was someone there. We continued walking towards the noise, and then we saw it. There was a small group of people in the far corner of the cemetery, probably 10 of them. They were gathered in a small circle, all of them wearing dark clothes and masks. There was a single person lying on the ground in the middle of the circle, not moving. Although we couldn't make out the words to their chant, it was extremely unsettling. The 3 of us looked at each other. Phil and Connor were as terrified as I was. we turned around and quietly snuck out of there. I felt a tremendous relief when we were back on the lit street. We never told anybody about what we saw that night, but the three of us did discuss it amongst ourselves. Connor thought they may have just been another group of kids trying to have a fun, scary Halloween, but I don't think so. There was something chilling about that chant, and what were they doing with that one person laying on the ground in the middle of the circle? I don't know what they were up to that night, and I'm glad that we didn't stay to find out. Every Halloween, my friend Will would have a party on his property. He was just outside the city where we lived. His family had a small farm. Most of my friends lived in the suburbs, but it was not a long way to get to Will's place out in the country. There was a lot of space there, so pretty much everyone in our grade was invited. His parents were okay with the party, but we all had to stay outside. Nobody was allowed in the house. That was especially important because his parents were away at their own Halloween party. It was fine with us because there was a ton of space there and a big fire pit on the property. It was always a good time. One year, however, something terrifying happened. It started like any other party at his place. I was one of the first to show up, so I helped get the fire going. As time went on, others trickled in. It was all people from our high school, so I recognized pretty much everyone, with very few exceptions, although some people would occasionally bring friends from other schools. Of course it was Halloween, so most people were dressed up and I might not know who was who at first glance. The sun was starting to set, but the fire had grown large, and it was easy to see everyone's costume. I went with my typical low-effort outfit. I had a Scream-style mask that I wore almost every year, although I would keep it up over my forehead for most of the night, since it would get uncomfortable after a while. After around an hour, there were at least 20 or 30 people. We were all gathered in a large circle around the fire. Everyone was talking, laughing, and just having a good time. I was talking to my friend Chris when I noticed someone standing by himself across the circle. He was wearing a dark hoodie with some kind of scary-looking mask as a costume. The rest of his clothes were just normal. Another low-effort costume. I can't judge. I stared at him for several seconds, wondering who he was. I didn't think I knew him, but it was hard to tell with his face covered. I wasn't worried or anything, more curious at this point. After another few minutes, I walked over to the guy and tried to start a conversation. I just asked some basic questions, like how's it going, or something like that. When I heard his voice, I was surprised because he didn't sound like anyone who I knew from school, but I figured that he might be somebody's guest, so I didn't interrogate him or anything. It was strange, though, for a guest to be standing around by himself. Normally, if someone brings a guest, then they're with a group. After we talked for a few minutes, I excused myself and went to find Will. Will was hanging out in a group around the fire, too. I pulled him aside and said, "Hey man, I was just talking to some guy who I don't recognize. I'm not sure who he knows here." "Okay, cool. Thanks. Where is he?" Will replied. I turned to look to where I'd seen the guy, but I couldn't find him. It seemed that he'd disappeared into the crowd or something. Will and I walked around for a while, but we couldn't find the guy. After a quick search, Will and I decided that it was probably no big deal, and we went back to the party. At around midnight, the party was winding down. We made sure to put out the fire, then people started to take off. I went home and got to bed at around 1 a.m. The next morning, my phone woke me up at 6 a.m. It was Will. He told me that his house was robbed that night. Someone broke a window and stole a bunch of valuable stuff from his parents. Will told the police that he'd seen a strange guy at the party and that he may have been responsible. I went to the police station to give them a description, but unfortunately, it was Halloween and the guy was wearing a mask, so my description was not very useful. I tried to describe his voice, but that probably wasn't much help either. They did eventually catch the burglar, because he was caught trying to sell some of Will's mom's jewelry to a local pawn shop. I never found out for sure if it was the guy from the party, but my guess is that it probably was. Back when I was 14 years old, my brother Alex had a Halloween party at our house. He was a few years older, and he was really trying to be popular at school at the time. A lot of people go through that phase, and he saw this party as an opportunity to make a name for himself among the more popular kids. I was kind of seen as his nerdy little brother, a source for embarrassment. Therefore, Alex told me that I had to stay in my bedroom for the entire night. That was fine with me because at that age, I was a really shy and reserved person. The idea of a big rowdy Halloween party did not seem like fun to me. Our parents were out of town for the weekend, so it was just Alex and I until his guests started showing up. As soon as 2 or 3 people had trickled in, I headed up to my room. I spent the next several hours playing some Xbox. I had a pretty sweet gaming setup at the time. I could spend days in there without getting bored. The noise from the party was loud, but it didn't bother me much, especially since I used over-the-ear headphones for gaming. The sound of the loud pop music and people talking formed a constant, almost ambient background noise, heavily muffled by my headphones. I could almost feel it through the floor as much as I could hear it. That continued for a few hours without much change, but suddenly I heard a loud scream, probably from a female. Then the talking stopped and the music was turned off. It was silent. I was startled by the change. The abrupt end to the party had me worried, so I timidly got up from my gaming chair and tiptoed down the hall to the stairs. I slowly stepped halfway down until I could peek below to the main floor and see what was going on. As I poked my head down, I could see that there were only a few people left at the party. Alex was one of them, and he was holding the phone up to his ear. I stood there confused for several seconds. Then I took 2 more steps down the staircase. That was when I realized what had happened. There was a guy laying on the ground in a puddle of what looked like blood. Someone had been attacked. It turned out that Alex was on the phone with the police, and a minute later, an ambulance arrived and took the guy to the hospital. The police arrived not more than a minute later. I tried to sneak back up to my room, but one of the officers saw me on the stairs and called me down. It turned out that 2 of the party guests had gotten into a fight, and one of them had stabbed the other. When that happened, the party quickly dispersed, and most of the guests got out of there. The only people that were left were Alex, me, and a few of Alex's closest friends. Obviously, there were a ton of witnesses for what happened, so the perpetrator was quickly caught. I think he got a few years in prison for it. I think he avoided some of the more serious charges because the other guy actually threw a few punches before. Luckily, the victim survived and made a good recovery. A few years ago when I was 22, I went to a Halloween party at a bar downtown with a few of my friends. I had volunteered to be the designated driver that night because I was trying to cut back on alcohol. The night was actually pretty fun, even though I was stone cold sober around a bunch of drunk people. The bar had free non-alcoholic drinks for designated drivers, so I had a few Cokes, then I moved on to coffee. By the end of the night, I had 3 or 4 cups of coffee, so I was pretty wired. We left the party at around midnight. I dropped my friends off at their places, then I drove home. I had a ground floor apartment with my own entrance at the front. There was a small patio that I had to walk through to get there. I opened the door and stepped inside, still feeling the caffeine. My hand was shaking slightly when I flicked on the light switch. I looked over at my couch and TV, thinking that it looked like a good place to sit and wait for the caffeine to wear off. Since it was Halloween, I decided to watch some of the old horror movies that I'd not seen in a long time. I started with the first Friday the 13th film, then continued to the second. Partway through the second film, I heard a loud knock on my door. I was startled and confused. It was past 2 a.m., so trick-or-treating was long over. Maybe I should have just ignored it, but I was too curious not to take a look. I muted the TV and slowly tiptoed to my front door. Once there, I pressed my eye up to the peephole on the door. Standing in front of my apartment was a man in a full clown costume. He wore an orange wig with some pretty elaborate makeup. It looked super creepy. I took a step back and started shaking. My mind raced as I considered my options. Calling the police was a good option, but I decided not to bother with them since nothing really happened yet. After some consideration, I decided to just ignore it and see what he does. He continued knocking for a few more minutes, but never said a word. I stood there behind the door hoping he would just go away, and eventually, that's exactly what he did. I could see his shadow through my curtains as he slowly walked past my window and away from my door. I guess he got bored, I laughed to myself. By then, I had pretty much given up on getting any sleep, so I went back to the movie. I eventually passed out at around the 5th installment of the Friday the 13th franchise. I woke up on my couch to a knock at the door at around 11 a.m. Half expecting to see another creepy clown, I walked over to check it out. Looking through my peephole, what I saw might have been even more surprising than the clown. It was the police. I opened the door and stood there in front of the officers, a confused look on my face. The police explained to me that there had been a robbery in my building. My neighbor a few doors down had been woken up by a knock on her door in the middle of the night, and when she answered it, she was attacked, one of the officers told me. The other officer chimed in and added that the attacker was a man in a full clown costume. It must have been the same guy, I thought. I promptly told the officers what had happened to me the night before, that I saw a guy in a clown costume and that he tried knocking on my door too. They took a statement from me, but really, I was not able to tell them anything that they weren't already aware of. As far as I know, the clown was never caught. As a side note, I wanted to know why my neighbor decided to open the door for the guy, but I don't really know her that well, and I thought it might be rude to ask. Who opens the door for a strange clown in the middle of the night? Not me. I'm in my last year of high school now, and this happened on Halloween night of last year. Me and my friends were too old for trick-or-treating, and we were too young to drink and party. That's why we decided to go and explore an abandoned house that was near our school. Everyone knew about the place, because it was just off a pretty major road in our town. I don't really believe in ghosts, but if I did, then this place was a textbook example of a haunted house. It had wooden siding and window shutters that were painted white, but they were really old and dirty. The roof was brown shingles, and almost half of them were probably missing. After school, we all met at my friend Jay's house, because it was the closest. I brought my flashlight and a spare that I gave to my friend Ben. It was just the three of us, and we headed over there once it was kind of dark. When the house came into view, it was every bit as creepy as I remembered. The faint glow from the moon and the distant streetlights made the place look straight out of a horror movie. It was just what we were looking for. Even still, I was getting a little scared as we approached the back. We knew that the back door was opened, because we'd looked around that place before, but we had never been inside. I'm sure it was supposed to be sealed, but someone else must have broken it down. I went in first, and then the others followed. Broken glass and other debris crunched under our feet as we walked in. The place was an absolute disaster. Everything was either broken or missing. The only furniture was a smashed coffee table in the middle of the room. The kitchen was almost completely gutted, with no appliances, and even the countertops were missing. I had no idea if it was picked over by looters, or if the owner salvaged what they could. We didn't care at the time. It was just interesting to see. Next, we heard a noise from the other side of the house. It was like a creak in the floorboard, or maybe a door. I was startled, but not that scared. We made our way down the hall. There was another room on the ground floor, and it seemed like that's where the noise came from. It might have been a bedroom or an office, and we thought we'd check it out. As we walked down the hallway, we took time to check out some of the graffiti. It was clear that we were not the first ones there. We knew it was a popular spot for other kids. When we got to the room, I poked my head around the corner. There was no door. As soon as I looked in, it seemed much like the rest of the house. Garbage everywhere, graffiti, and no furniture. There was no sign of anything that could have made the noise, so we walked in to look around some more. As soon as we were in, I heard the noise again. I turned around and saw a man standing in the corner facing the wall. We never saw his face, but he had long gray hair. We could also tell that he was wearing a mask, probably a cheap plastic clown mask. I jumped and yelled some curse words instinctively. My two friends saw him too, and did the same. As soon as we came to our senses, the three of us bolted out of there. We made it to the back door and out to the street. Once we were out, we went across the street to catch our breath. When we looked back to the house, I saw a man in a clown mask poke his head out from around the corner. He didn't chase us anymore, and we soon got out of there. We went back to Jay's house to play some video games and talk about the night. For the rest of the evening, we discussed what happened, but we still have no idea what that guy was doing in there alone, or if he was actually dangerous. This happened on Halloween night 5 years ago. I was 23 at the time, and I had just moved to my house. It was a single story with 2 bedrooms and an unfinished basement. I was renting the second room to my friend Joseph, who I knew from college. I was pretty excited to have my own place, and I wanted to be a good neighbor, so I thought it was important to stay in and give out candy to the neighborhood kids. Joseph went out to a Halloween party, and I was planning to join him after the trick-or-treaters were done. I waited around until 8:30 giving out candy. I still had a large amount left, which I was planning to share with Joseph. I took the candy bowl into the kitchen and put it on the counter, and I went to my room to get ready for the party. It was at our other friend's house, which was around a 20-minute bus ride away. As soon as I got out of the shower, I heard the doorbell ring. I thought it was too late for trick-or-treaters, but I was more than willing to give some kid their last for the night, so I walked over and opened it. Standing on my porch was what looked to be a grown man in some kind of costume. He seemed to be either a ghost or a mummy, or something in between. He had a sheet over most of him, with small pieces of cloth seemingly tied around his arms and legs. I wasn't sure exactly what he was going for, but that was what I saw. He was about 5'5", so he could have been 14 or 13, I guess. I couldn't tell for sure. He said trick or treat, but in a strange voice, like he was imitating a robot voice. It made it hard to tell if he was a grown-up or not. I was creeped out, but I didn't want to upset him, so I told him to wait, and then I went to go get the candy. I tried to shut the door, but when I did, the guy stuck his foot in, blocking me from closing it. I tried to look at his face to see if he was joking, but all I could see was the fabric of this strange costume. Not wanting to risk it, I kicked his foot out from the door and closed it, and locked it right away. The guy turned around and walked off after that. I watched out the window as he disappeared down the street. Thinking it was a bad joke, I went to my room to finish getting ready for the party. While I was in my room, I heard a loud crash from the front of my house. It was the sound of glass shattering. I burst out of my room into the living room to find that my front window was broken. Just then, the other window smashed and a large rock rolled up near my feet. I looked out and saw 2 guys standing in front of my place. One of them was the weird ghost mummy from before. The other guy was wearing a ninja mask and all black clothes. I called the police right away, and the next time I looked out, the 2 men were gone. The police came a few minutes later, but not soon enough to catch them. I told them everything I knew about what happened that night, and they told me they would investigate. That wouldn't help though, because I never found out who they were. It wouldn't have been hard for them to rip off their costumes and blend in with everyone else. What I still wonder about it is if they were really kids, or if they were adults doing things like that. I guess it's scarier if they were grown, because they could do more harm. I didn't know all my neighbors at the time, but now I do, and I don't think any of them matches the description of those guys. They must have come in from somewhere else. Me and my friends went trick-or-treating when we were younger. It was a long time ago, but I think we were in 7th grade, making us around 13 or 14. For the first time, we were allowed to go out without any parents, and we were all excited. Not that it would make such a big difference, it's just that it made us feel a little more grown up. We didn't have any desire to get into trouble or anything like that. The night was, as always, about candy, and we wanted to get as much of it as we could. It was like a competition in my neighborhood, and everyone would always exaggerate about how much they got. Since we were a little older, and we had been many times before, we knew the neighborhood really well. It consisted of one main street, called Brock Street, with many cul-de-sacs splitting off of it. My house was on one of them, and my friends lived nearby. To get to any other area, you would have to go down a busier street with mostly businesses and not very many houses. It was a waste of time, so we usually stayed in our area. I went with my two friends Chris and Phil, and we met at my house to start. After hitting all the houses on my street, we moved on to the next section. We were making really good time, and it wasn't long before we had hit all the houses in our small neighborhood. There was a lot of time left, so I suggested that we go down the busier street to find some more houses. As we walked down the narrow sidewalk, we noticed there were no other trick-or-treaters around. The houses out there were not decorated like the others in our neighborhood either. We tried a few doorbells, but we didn't get any answers. It was starting to look like a lost cause. We might have come all that way and wasted our last bit of time. The three of us kept walking, and eventually we noticed it was getting pretty dark. Chris mentioned that he had to be home pretty soon, so we decided to turn around. After taking 5 or 10 steps back towards our neighborhood, a car slowed beside us. It was a newer looking sedan, and it was dark blue in color. A single man sat in the driver's seat, and there was nobody else in the car. We stopped, thinking it was just somebody asking for directions or something. Instead, the man said that my mom sent him to come pick us up. That made no sense, because I knew she would never do that. I told the guy thanks, but said that we could walk. Right as soon as I said that, the guy sped away. My friends and I looked at each other, and after a few awkward seconds, I said, "What was that?" They both shrugged and said they didn't know. We continued walking, and went to our separate houses. When I got home, I told my dad about the guy in the car. He completely freaked out. That was when I realized that it was serious. The cops interviewed me for a good half hour. After that, they went to talk to Chris and Phil as well. Because of what happened afterwards, we figured the guy was some kind of creep trying to pick up kids on Halloween. If I had to guess, I'd say that he thought we were younger than we were. That would explain why he bailed as soon as he heard my voice. I guess with our costumes, it would have been hard to tell if we were on the older side. His lie seemed really obvious to me, but I wonder if it would have worked on some younger kids. I guess we'll never know, because fortunately, our encounter with that guy was the only one that I'm aware of, and no missing kids were reported that night. I lived in a small house by myself when this happened. It was a few years ago on Halloween, and I've since moved out to a bigger place. This place had 2 bedrooms, and it was in a somewhat rough neighborhood. It was the kind of place where you keep your doors locked at all times, even when you're home. I never had a problem with muggings or anything like that, but there were some break-ins occasionally. Not the worst place in the world, but far from an ideal suburb. I didn't mind though, because it was close to downtown and several public transit routes. Like I said, this happened on Halloween, and when I lived there, I would usually stay home to give out candy to the 5 or 10 kids who would come to my door. It was hardly worth it, but Halloween was always my favorite holiday when I was younger, and I wanted the neighborhood kids to have that experience. I finished work at 5 as usual, and went home to get ready for the trick-or-treaters. After I had some dinner, I turned on the TV and put on a scary movie while I waited. Eventually, a few trick-or-treaters came. I knew most of them from around the neighborhood and from other years, so it was about what I was expecting. When it began to get late, I thought the night was over, so I went back to my living room. That was when the doorbell rang one last time. I turned around and grabbed my candy bowl to answer it. When I opened the door, there was a little boy standing on my porch, but he was alone. This kid must have been 8 years old at the most, judging by his size. He was wearing some kind of a monster costume with a full mask, so I wasn't sure about his age. He was young though. I put a handful of candy into his bag, and I looked around to see if he had a parent. That was when I saw a man standing on the other side of the street watching. He was standing next to a dark SUV, just peering at us. The SUV had a red ball on the antenna and fancy silver trim on the side doors. Before I had a chance to say anything, the boy turned around and ran to the man. I saw them get into the SUV, but then I turned away before I could see if they drove off or not. Most parents would come right up to the door with kids that age, but maybe he was trying to teach his son to be confident or something. I didn't know, so I let it go and went back to my movie. My eyelids became heavy as I stared at the TV screen, but I started to hear noises from the back of my house. Sounded like people talking. Judging by where it was coming from, the people would have had to be on my property, so I went to check it out. When I got there was nobody to be seen. Thinking it was my imagination, I was about to go to bed, but first I decided to check the front part of my street. When I looked out, I saw that dark SUV from before. It was sitting out there, but it was a little farther down the road than it was before. In any case, I went upstairs to brush my teeth and then go to bed. When I was in the bathroom, I heard a window smash. Knowing it was a break-in, I ran to my room to get my phone. When I was in there, I closed my door and held it shut with my body. I called 911 and told them to hurry, and then I focused on keeping the door closed. I could hear at least 2 men walking around downstairs. Minutes later, the police burst in. I was pretty sure from what I heard that the robbers were still there. It sounded like they were being arrested. After another few minutes, I felt like it was safe to come out, so I did. The officers were still there collecting evidence. It turned out that the guys broke a small window at the back of my house, and then used that to unlock a door. I found out later that it was in fact the man in the dark SUV that I saw before. It seemed that he had used his son on Halloween in order to scope out potential burglary victims. I was the unlucky one that time. The most disturbing part about that story is that while the break-in was happening, the young boy who I gave candy to earlier was sitting in the SUV alone, waiting for the robbery to finish. Someone's getting nominated for Father of the Year. It was Halloween night in 2010, and I was 12 years old. Ever since I was really young, I would go trick-or-treating with the same group of friends. My school was really small, so I didn't have a lot of choice anyway. Our neighborhood was very low on crime, so we were allowed to go trick-or-treating on our own. We did so since we were 9 or 10. Therefore, we were pretty comfortable with our area. Looking back, I could admit that we were naive. I'd definitely do things differently with the power of hindsight. Once we all got our costumes on, me and my friends met at my place to start trick-or-treating. My mom gave me a cell phone to take with me. I didn't have my own yet, but my mom made me take it whenever I was out without my parents. There were 3 of us in total. It was me and my friends Jake and Jude. We all dressed up in different low-effort costumes. I was a ninja, but I don't remember exactly what the rest of them were. It was around 6 o'clock, and the sun was pretty much gone. It wasn't completely dark yet, but the streets were well lit anyway. The roads were organized in a grid format with rows of houses. There was a small woods and a river on the far end, and our school was right in front of that. We rang doorbells for a while, getting a decent amount of candy. At one point, a car passed us slowly. There was a single man, and he was dressed in a really extravagant clown costume. Looked like he might have been some kind of professional. We could see as he passed that his makeup was partially wiped off. It was a creepy sight, and we all noticed it. The man took a long stare at us, but never stopped. Within 10 or 15 seconds, he turned down a street and was out of our sight. I looked at Jake and saw that he was a little concerned too, but neither of us said anything. We kept going for another hour or two, but by around 8:30, most of the houses had their lights off. It usually means it's all over. We tried to go to one last house, but when we rang the doorbell, no one answered. After that, we accepted that there was no more trick-or-treating. By that time, we were right near the woods, and only a few houses down from the school. Since we were all having a good time, none of us wanted to go home yet. Knowing our parents, they wouldn't start to get worried until at least 9 or 9:30, so we decided to hang out and dig into our candy a bit. I suggested that we go over to the school and hang out in the playground. Although the streets were lined with lampposts, the school was quite dark. When we walked into the gate, we could barely see at all. After a few minutes, our eyes adjusted and we walked over to the basketball courts where there was a long bench. The 3 of us sat down there and started talking. We were there for about 10 minutes when we saw a dark figure walking towards us. Jude noticed it first and pointed it out to the others. I was worried that we were going to get in trouble for being out there after hours. It kept getting closer, and when it did, we could tell that it was a man. He was large, at least 6'2", and wearing a clown costume. My mind immediately remembered that creepy-looking guy in the car earlier, and I was pretty sure it was him. Eventually, he was standing right in front of us. His face was smeared with white makeup. Other than that, he looked normal from the neck up. He wasn't wearing a wild wig or a funny hat like you might expect. From the neck down, though, he was in full clown attire, right down to the giant shoes. My friends and I stopped talking and stared up at the guy. The first thing he said to us was something like,
"Hey guys, how's it going?"
We were all silent. Just then, I felt my phone vibrating. The ringer was on silent, but I knew someone was calling. I didn't answer it though, because I was too focused on that creepy clown standing right in front of me. The man then said,
"I have a lot of candy left over from the party I was just at. Come with me, and we'll get it."
He pointed out to the street, and I could see a car parked near the school. After a while, my phone was going crazy. I didn't know if it was calls, text messages, or both. We all looked at each other. None of us trusted that guy, but I didn't know what to do. Out of nowhere, Jude got up and sprinted in the opposite direction. In hindsight, that was the smartest thing you could do. There was no way that guy was going to be able to chase us with those giant clown shoes. Jake and I followed. When we got to the back fence of the playground, the gate was closed. We stopped for a second and then looked back. The clown man was standing around 150 feet away, not running, but walking towards us. We then climbed the fence and found ourselves outside the woods that backed onto the school. There was a pathway that went along the fence. We went the opposite direction to where the car was, and when we got out to the street, we felt a little safer. That was when I checked my phone. I had 5 missed calls, all from my mom. There were also a few text messages, also from my mom. I opened one of them, and all it said was "come home now," in all capitals. My friends and I ran to our respective houses, making it there in 5 or 10 minutes. When I got home, my mom was waiting at the front door, crying. She hugged me when I walked up to the porch. That was when I noticed at least 2 police cars circling our street. I still didn't understand what was happening, but I would soon find out. My mom asked me where I was, so I told her what happened at the school. As soon as I did, she called the police. They were there in less than a minute. The cops interviewed me on my porch, asking me for every detail about the man I saw and what his car looked like. After about 10 minutes, they were gone. Apparently what happened was that there was a kidnapping attempt that night. A kid a few years younger than us was almost abducted by a man in a clown costume, not far from where we were at the school. Luckily, the kid was out with his mom, and she was able to scare the guy away, and then she called the cops. My mom was blowing up my phone because she knew there was somebody out there, and I was out without parents. As far as I know, the man was never caught, but this was the first and only incident of its kind that ever happened in my neighborhood. I lived there until I graduated high school, and as far as I know, it was an isolated incident. Halloween is a time when everybody wants to be scared, but this was on another level. It was too much. We had a Halloween party at my house when I was in college. I was in my 3rd year, and I had a house with my 3 friends. We would have a few parties at our place every year. It would just be our extended friend group that would be invited. We never did the wild everyone can come type of party. It was just friends and friends of friends that we would let in. It was 8 o'clock on the 31st of October. Our neighborhood was mostly student houses, so we got very few trick-or-treaters. If my memory is right, it was just 2 families that came by. Our next-door neighbor had 2 kids, plus another family that was in the apartment building across the street. I decided to go to the store, pick up some drinks before everyone arrived. On my way back, I passed a guy on the sidewalk a few streets away from my house. He was wearing a strange costume. It looked like he was some kind of patient from an insane asylum, but he had his entire face covered with a white cloth. Also on the cloth were large black dots where the eyes would be. I also noticed that he was carrying a sack or a pillowcase that was full. It looked like he was trick-or-treating, but he was way too old. It was creepy, but I guess that's the point. By the time I got back home, a few of my friends had shown up. There were 8 or 10 people there in total. Being that it was Halloween, everybody was wearing costumes. I dressed as Don Draper from Mad Men, because I wanted everyone to think that I'm cool and handsome. I won't go over everybody else's costumes in detail, but it was everything from bedsheet ghosts to more elaborate ones. We poured a few drinks and turned on some music. As it got later into the night, more people showed up. By 10 o'clock, there were 20 or 25 people there. I knew everyone I had seen so far, although some people were covering their faces with their costumes. Even though I was drinking a little, I stayed pretty sober for the whole night. One of my other roommates did the same, just to make sure everything stayed under control. We had a good group of friends though, so there were no real problems. By 11, things had reached their peak. There were about 30 people there. A little more than I was expecting, but it was still under control. Nobody was super drunk, no fights or anything. I was standing around in the kitchen talking with a friend when I looked into the living room. I saw somebody walk by who was out of place. It looked like that weird guy who I saw on the sidewalk before, the one who was dressed like a mental hospital patient. He walked by quickly and was out of my view in no time. I barely even noticed, and I wasn't sure if it was really him. Curious enough to check it out, I excused myself and walked off in the direction where he went. Past our living room was the upstairs and also the stairs to the basement. When I turned the corner, I realized that he must have gone in one of those two places. I saw both staircases, but the mysterious man was gone. The basement of the house was unfinished, and we just used it for storage and laundry. There wasn't really anything down there, so I decided to check the upstairs first. When I walked up the stairs, I could hear somebody rummaging around in my room. I peeked around the corner and got a glimpse of that creepy guy in the asylum costume. We were being robbed. Although I wanted to burst in there and confront him, it was smarter to get help. I called the police first and described the guy who I saw. He had a pretty distinct look, so it was easy. Next, I found one of my roommates to make sure he didn't get away. We walked to the bottom of the stairs. When I looked up, I was met with a terrifying sight. He was standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at us. He was holding a bag in one hand. "Hey man, I called the police. Just put everything back and you can go," I said. The guy didn't hesitate. He briskly walked down the stairs. When he was halfway down, I saw him pull a knife out from somewhere. Holding the knife in one hand and the bag in the other, my roommate and I moved out of the way. There were two of us and one of him, but neither of us was armed, and we didn't want to get stabbed. We stood there and watched the guy disappear into the crowd, and then the door opened and slammed. Minutes later, the police arrived. I answered the door to two officers. Down on the sidewalk in front of my house, there were another two cops, and they had someone in handcuffs. It looked like the guy we had seen before, but now his face was showing. They must have taken his mask off. Our intruder looked just like a normal guy. He was clean cut and maybe 30 years old, if not even younger. The police told me that they arrested the man moments ago. I was positive that it was him. If I wasn't sure enough already, after going through the bag that he was carrying, they found my laptop, along with each of my roommates' laptops. He also had some other things that belonged to one of my roommates. During my conversation with the police, I mentioned that he also threatened me with a knife. I was hoping that would add additional charges, but there's no telling if it made a difference. It was around midnight by then, so we waited it out for people to go home. By 1, it was just me and my other roommates. We spent the next hour cleaning the house and talking about what just happened. All in all, it was by far the scariest Halloween of my life. Sometimes I wonder if the man was just bluffing with the knife. Would he have actually stabbed us if we didn't get out of the way? We never found out how dangerous he actually was, but I'm glad that we didn't take that chance. I've always loved Halloween, but last year something happened that almost changed that. I'm 25 years old, so I was 24 at the time. I lived alone in a ground floor apartment that was half of the main floor of an older house. The floor was divided up into two separate apartments with their own entrances that were right next to each other. My landlord was in the other one. He was away on vacation when this happened. There were some kids around there, so although I was way too old to be trick-or-treating, I would still join in by giving out candy. When Halloween night came, I was all ready with a good amount of candy. There were some families among my neighbors who I knew well, and I always tried to be one of the more generous to the kids who came to my door. On this Halloween night in particular, though, it was pouring rain. I wasn't sure how many of them would still go out. There was one year when I was a kid where we had a blizzard on the 31st, so the whole neighborhood agreed to delay Halloween by a week or so. It didn't happen this night, so I figured it was still on. Early in the night, I looked out my front window and saw a car parked on my street right in front of the house. Rain was pelting it, but I could still see that there were 3 grown men inside. They seemed to be wearing costumes of some kind, but I couldn't tell what they were. I figured they were going to some Halloween party, so I didn't worry. Shortly after, a few trick-or-treaters showed up. My doorbell rang for the first time at around 6 p.m. The rain was still pouring. I went to answer it, and there were a group of boys who were around 10 to 12 years old. I knew one of them from around the neighborhood. They were laughing and having a good time, clearly enjoying the ridiculousness of the night. I gave them some candy, and they ran off to the next house. That was when I noticed that the car from before was still there. It was a little further down the street, but it was definitely still the same one. The lights were on, and 3 guys were just sitting there. Again, I didn't worry, because there are a million reasonable explanations, but it did seem strange to me. Several more came to my door, and each time I went out, I saw that car was still there, still in the same spot, and the rain was still falling. It was even harder than before. By 7:30, I was pretty sure nobody else was coming, so I sat down in my living room and started watching a movie. I would usually watch at least a few classic horror movies on Halloween and dig into whatever candy was left. By 10 p.m., I was on my second movie, which was one of the Nightmare on Elm Street films. Then I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anybody, and it was too late for trick-or-treaters. As I sat in my living room, I looked out the window. The rain had eased up considerably, but it was still coming down somewhat. I got up from the couch and walked to the front door. My door had a small window that I could see through, and there were at least 2 guys standing on my porch. When I got closer, I looked out the larger window beside the door, and I could see there were 3 of them. They were around my age, if not a little older, and they were wearing Halloween costumes. One of them was an elf, or something like that. Another had some kind of superhero costume, and I have no idea what the third was wearing. My eyes then went to the street, and I could see that car from before was still there, but now it was empty. I was pretty sure the guys on my porch were the ones who were in the car. As I was looking out the window, one of them saw me.
Hey man, does Andrew live here?
He asked. No, I think you've got the wrong place, I said. He then said okay, and the 3 men walked away towards the car. It seemed like an honest mistake, but I was still curious why they were sitting out there that whole time. It was hours that they had been out there. Maybe they left and came back, but that would be just as suspicious. Whatever the case may be, I finished the movie and then watched part of another before it got late. At around midnight, I went to bed. By around 12:30, I was still awake, and I heard some noises on my porch. I thought I heard my next door neighbor's door open. That couldn't be, because he wasn't due back for another 2 days. Too curious to let it go, I tiptoed to my front door and looked out. There was nobody there, but when I turned my attention to the road, I could see that same car from before. There was a single man sitting in the driver's seat. Although it was dark, I was pretty sure he was one of the men that came to my door earlier. All of a sudden, I started to hear footsteps in my landlord's place. The walls were pretty thin, so I could clearly tell that somebody was there. At least one person, probably 2. Since I knew that my landlord was away, it must have been a break-in. I got the police on the line and whispered that somebody was robbing my next-door neighbor. I gave them the address and told them to hurry. As I waited for the police, the noises continued. There were definitely 2 people in my neighbor's place. Not long later, the police showed up. I heard the whole thing from my apartment. As I listened, my biggest fear was that I would hear a gunshot, but luckily that never happened. I looked out my window and saw 2 men being led away in handcuffs. As you may have already guessed, they were the 2 guys who showed up on my doorstep earlier in the night. I have no doubt that they came to my door to check if I was home. If I wasn't, then maybe I would have been targeted as well. The one thing they didn't count on was the fact that I could hear through my neighbor's walls. If not for that, then they probably would have gotten away with it. It was Halloween of 2020, and I was in the 12th grade. My friends and I had grown out of trick-or-treating a long time ago, but we still liked to celebrate the occasion. My friend Dan lived in a different neighborhood, and his parents were okay with us having people over, so it was our go-to spot whenever we wanted to have a party or a gathering of any kind. I lived in a different neighborhood, which was about an hour away on foot, so I took the bus there. There was one other guy in my friend group who lived in my neighborhood, so we actually took the bus together. Tom lived a few doors down from me, and we had been good friends since about the 3rd grade. Neither of us bothered to get dressed up or anything. I was never really into that. Nothing much happened at the party. It was a pretty typical night. We mostly just talked about whatever and played Super Smash Bros. In Dan's basement. I don't even know if party is the right word. There were only 7 or 8 of us. By the time we decided to head home, it was past 11, and the bus that we needed was not running anymore. Since it was only an hour on foot, Tom and I decided to walk instead of bothering our parents. Our route home was all on well-lit streets, and our neighborhood is pretty safe, so we were not that worried. It was actually a pretty nice night. Tom and I were really good friends, and we were happy to have the time to talk, and if I'm being completely honest, we did a bit of gossiping as well. Even though it was a Saturday evening, the streets were pretty much deserted. We only saw 5 or 6 cars the last half hour of walking. We were about halfway home when a brown van passed us on the street. It slowed down when it was about 20 feet ahead of us. Tom and I looked at each other with concern. The van stopped, and we continued walking. I was hoping that it was nothing, and that it stopped for some other reason. Tom and I stopped talking and looked forward as we walked past the van. When we were in front of it, it started moving again, but slowly. It was driving at our walking pace. We tried to ignore it, but suddenly we heard a voice from the front seat. "Hey guys, what are you doing out so late? Need a ride?" a man said. We continued walking, but I turned my head and said, "No thanks, we're good." He kept driving slowly beside us, trying to convince us to take the ride. The guy gave a few reasons why we should accept the offer. It's cold outside, it's dangerous to be walking alone. He even said that we could get in trouble for being out so late. We were in 12th grade, so we weren't stupid. So the more we talked, the more we were sure that we were not getting into this guy's van. Tom and I were genuinely creeped out at this point. We knew that we needed to get away from this guy, but we didn't know how to do it. If we really needed to, we could have knocked on some doors of the houses in the area. It was all residential around there, and I'm sure that would have scared him off. However, after another few minutes, a police car turned down the street and approached us from behind. This was strange because the police did not come to this neighborhood often. If we saw a police car, it usually meant that someone had called for it. The black and white car slowly cruised towards us, and as soon as it got close, the van took off. The officer stopped next to us and called us over. "Hey guys, do you know who that was in the van?" the officer said to us. We said that we didn't, and then told him the whole story. After that, the officer told us that several people had called complaining about a guy in a van bothering kids while they were trick-or-treating earlier. It turned out that he'd been looking for this guy for a few hours. The police officer gave Tom and I a ride home and assured us that another officer was going to be dealing with the van. This was a pretty scary incident, but I realize it could have been a lot worse. I can only imagine what he would have done if we'd gotten in. If we were younger or more naive, then maybe we would have. But luckily, that didn't happen. Not this time. Where I come from, the night before Halloween is a special occasion of its own. It's a night meant for mischief and trouble. This is the night where some of the more rebellious kids go around and egg houses, throw toilet paper over trees, and just cause general mischief. I'm not proud to say it, but when I was younger, I was one of those more rebellious kids, and I got into my share of trouble for things that me and my friends did on October 30th. By trouble, I mean getting grounded mostly. I even had my Xbox taken away one year. But this story is about a completely different kind of trouble. In fact, it was one of the most horrifying things that's ever happened to me. I was in the 10th grade, and I'd recently started hanging out with a different group of friends. My group from elementary school had lost touch when we started high school. We went to a pretty large school, the largest in the city, I think. It was at least a few thousand students, so everyone seemed to gravitate toward whichever group they wanted. My new friends were seen somewhat as troublemakers, but I thought and still think that they were actually good guys deep down. We would do little things like sneaking into the movies or doing prank calls to the teachers' houses. Nothing serious, but we did get into some trouble. So when Halloween was approaching, it went without saying that we would go out and do something. We met at my friend Justin's house. He lived just down the street from me, so I just walked over. Our other friend Travis lived farther away, so he had his dad drop him off. I brought my black school bag, but I emptied out all the books and filled it with 8 to 10 rolls of toilet paper. I bet you can guess what that was for. Travis did the same, but he brought a few cartons of eggs instead. It was still bright out. The streetlights hadn't even come on yet, so we hung out in Justin's basement and played some video games while we waited for the night to fall. At around 10 or 11 p.m., we started walking around the neighborhood. The streets were not quite as empty as we were hoping. There were still cars driving around, and most of the houses had lights on. It would be difficult to do anything without getting caught, so we continued walking for several blocks. Eventually, we found a section of the street that looked a little quieter. We chose a house there and threw a few eggs. Then we tossed a roll of toilet paper over the bushes in the front of the house. It was all decorated for Halloween with a few large pumpkins on the front porch. It seemed like nobody was home, so Travis walked up and grabbed one of the pumpkins, lifted it over his head, and smashed it on the walkway. Just then, the lights turned on and the door opened. A large man stood in front of us. He was probably 6'4", but at the moment, he looked even bigger. He had short hair and a beard. His eyes were shooting daggers at us, but he didn't say a word. Justin and I bolted, but Travis must have frozen in fear, and the man grabbed him. We looked back when we realized that our friend was missing. The man had his arms wrapped around Travis. I couldn't tell for sure what he was trying to do, but thankfully, he didn't seem to be throwing any punches. As we got closer, it became clear that the guy was trying to drag Travis into his house. Travis screamed, but the man didn't let go. The anger on his face was spilling out. Small drops of saliva spouted from his open mouth as he breathed with the intensity of a gorilla. His bloodshot eyes turned to me as I approached them. We grabbed Travis's arm and pulled with all our might. He screamed out in pain as we stretched his body. Eventually, the man let go, and the three of us sprinted out of there. We ran as fast as we could past the rows of houses until we felt safe enough to stop and catch our breath. I realized that what we did was wrong, and I wouldn't recommend anyone try it. Fun is fun, but vandalizing a stranger's house is not in the spirit of Halloween. However, I don't think we deserved what happened to us, and it still terrifies me to think of what would have happened if that guy managed to get Travis into his house. This happened several years ago on Halloween, when my kids were still young. I had taken them trick-or-treating that evening, and had my parents come over to hand out candy at our house. My parents lived in a high-rise building that was all senior citizens, so they didn't have to hand out candy at their place. My neighborhood, however, was much younger. At least half of my neighbors had kids that were trick-or-treating age, so we always went through a lot of candy. I didn't mind though, because I've always loved Halloween. One of the joys of being a parent is that you get to relive a lot of your favorite things from your youth, so I always enjoyed trick-or-treating with my son and daughter. We know most of the people in our immediate neighborhood, so I don't think we talked to a single stranger the whole night. Also, my kids were young, so we were pretty slow and only managed to hit 10 or 15 houses total. We called it a night around 8 p.m. and then headed home. After I put my kids to bed, my wife and I saw my parents out. By this time it was around 10 p.m. My wife and I sat on the couch and watched some TV. I was eating a few pieces of leftover Halloween candy when the doorbell rang. I stood up and walked to the front, then looked out the window beside the door. There was a man standing there alone. He was about 6 feet tall, wearing black pants and a black sweatshirt. He had some kind of Halloween mask on, but it was pulled up over his forehead. He saw my face when I looked out the window and smiled at me. Against my better judgment, I opened the door and stood there blocking the entrance to my house with my body. The man introduced himself and said that he was just taking his son trick-or-treating in the neighborhood. Then he asked if he could use my washroom. I looked at him confused for a few seconds, then finally asked, "Well, where's your son?" "Oh, he's just waiting in the car," the man replied. That didn't make any sense. First, it was very unusual for anyone to drive into our neighborhood to trick-or-treat. I get that some people live out in the country and can't do it in their own neighborhood, but it is very uncommon. Second, it was past 10 p.m., and trick-or-treating had been over for at least an hour by then, so what was he doing during that time? All that considered, I politely declined and firmly closed my door and made sure to lock it. I stood there for 30 seconds or so, waiting for the man to leave. When he did leave, I poked my head out the window and watched as he walked to the street and got into his car. I had to squint my eyes to make sure, but I'm absolutely certain that there was nobody waiting in the car. He didn't have a son with him at all. I was suspicious of this man from the start, but I still have no idea what that guy wanted to do in my house. Maybe he was some kind of burglar trying to scope us out as a target. We didn't really have anything valuable though, so I'm not really sure why all the effort would be worth it. I'd understand if we had a secret vault filled with gold bars that he was trying to pull off some kind of epic heist, but that's not the case. Perhaps his motives were even more sinister, but that's something that I'd prefer not to even consider.